for 1 second. You might get a little notification that I'm recording. Great. So let's get started. Today, I'm going to go over some general writing tips. These are things, the trends that I have seen in the Writing Center time after time with students' papers that I think could really benefit everyone, no matter what stage of writing you're at or what program you're in. So today we're going to go over some general writing tips. Some of them are going to be more kind of grammar related. Some of them are going to be more general style related. So let's dive in. So the sentence level things I'm going to be going over today, I'm going to be going over different types of sentence issues like complete versus run-on sentences, active versus passive voice. We're going to talk about commas. I know it's a sexy subject, but it's a worthwhile one. It's an issue I see all the time. We'll talk about quotations and punctuation. And then we'll go into more general writing tips, things about like transition statements, scientific outlets and how to write for them versus, the difference between writing for a scientific outlet versus a creative or fiction outlet. And then we'll also talk about APA and text citations very briefly. I lead a whole APA presentation. So if you want to know more about APA, we can talk about that at a different time. But I'm going to just briefly talk about APA today. And then I'll give you some general tips and tricks. And then I'll send you on your way. So let's get started. So my first question, and I'd love to see your answers in the chat box. In general, for today's webinar, if you could just put your answers in the chat box, that would be greatly appreciated. What's wrong with this sentence? So the sentence reads, he is reading a book about counseling, or sorry, she is reading a book about counseling. He is running errands at the store. Great, I see something in the chat. It needs a period before he, says Candace. Very good. They're two completely different thoughts, says Deborah. Awesome. Yeah, you've identified it. So what's actually wrong with this sentence? What we call it as a run-on. So here's how to avoid run-on sentences. This is something I see all the time, and that was a pretty obvious example, but a lot of times we make this mistake, and here's how we can help identify not making this mistake. So we want to have an independent clause in a sentence. So an independent clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb and expresses a complete thought. So for example, that one we just looked at, she is reading a book about counseling, is its own independent clause. So you could end the sentence right there and be perfectly appropriate. And then he is running errands at the store is its own independent clause. So that could be its own sentence. Now you can also combine run-ons by using conjunctions, and, but, for, or, nor, so, yet, and a comma, or you can combine them using a semicolon. Semicolons aren't used too often in writing, but this is one of those few examples where you can actually use a semicolon. People usually abuse the semicolon, so make sure it's two independent clauses that you're combining. All right, so to fix that example that we looked at, we could say she is reading a book about counseling, comma, and he is running errands at the store. We could also say she is reading a book about counseling, semicolon, he is running errands at the store. So this one's incorrect, and I'd love to see some fixes in the chat. I didn't know which job I wanted. I was too confused to decide. That's an incorrect sentence because we know now it's a run-on. So how do we fix that sentence? Anyone can chat it in the chat box. Jacqueline's asking a really good question. So a semicolon is used in a sentence that can be, but does not have to be two different sentences. Jacqueline, you can do that, but I wouldn't recommend combining all your sentences using a semicolon. I wouldn't abuse that. I would try, if they're two different sentences, just keep them as two different sentences. But if it's an idea that you want as part of that sentence, but they're really independent clauses, then you'd use the semicolon. And Candace has a wonderful fix for us. She says, put a period after wanted. That's one way of going about it. Absolutely, Candace. Some other ways of going about it is putting a comma and saying and, or putting a semicolon. So run-ons, that's simple. I think you guys have a grasp on run-ons. So we're going to avoid them. So make a note. If you're writing notes on this presentation, I have little end slides to remind us of rules to avoid or rules to follow. So this one, we're going to avoid run-ons. So that's if I was taking notes on this, that's the note I would take, avoid run-ons. And if I were to add any notes to that, I would say things like add a semicolon or add a comma and a conjunction. All right. So which sentence is better for a paper? Sentence number 1, the student completed his first year of college with very good grades. Sentence number 2, the first year of college was completed by the student with very good grades. Which sentence do you think is better for a paper? Sentence 1 or sentence 2? Feel free to put it in the chat. Candace says sentence 1. Deborah says sentence 1. Jacqueline says sentence 1. I think the consensus is reached. Yes, that is the better sentence. But let's talk about why it's the better sentence. It's called active versus passive voice. So that first sentence is a great example of active voice. So active voice is when the grammar structure is using the subject coming before the object. So the subject in this example is the student. So that comes first. Then we have the verb completed. And finally, the object is his first year of college. So that comes second. So that's a good example of active voice. In general, it's good to note, if you're taking notes on this, active voice is when the subject comes before the object. And in most writing, you're going to see at the Chicago School, you're going to want to use active voice. We use active voice in our dissertations. We use it in our research papers. Very rarely will someone ask you to use passive voice, if at all. I have never seen a paper where passive voice was better than active voice. So what's the difference between active voice and passive voice? We'll take a quick look. So obviously it's when the object comes before the subject of the sentence, right? So the first year of college is the object and it's coming before the subject, which is the student. So the first year of college was completed by the student. So how do you know if you're using passive voice? Often you have to use more words to express your passive sentence. This one uses was completed by, whereas the other sentence just said completed, right? So when you're writing a sentence and you're asking yourself, is it passive or is it active? Am I using a lot of words to describe a verb that could just be simply used with one verb? Could I just say completed instead of saying was completed by? Sometimes writers, not you guys attending this, but sometimes writers think it's better to use passive voice because it's longer, right? It takes up more space and we need an academic writing. We want to take up space and meet that page count. But don't fall for that. Passive voice is not good for academic writing, especially at the Chicago School. We encourage active voice. Also, one thing to note, it's tricky with passive voice because it can lead to ambiguity in the meaning. So sometimes it's like unclear when you use passive voice. So when you're reading your own papers back to yourself, which I encourage you to do, with each sentence, just ask yourself real quick, and it becomes a really quick habit that eventually becomes just second nature. But ask yourself, does this sentence make sense? Is it clear? And if it's not, typically it's an issue with active versus passive voice. So to fix that sentence or to pick the correct one, we all got it on the first try. It's the first sentence. The student completed his first year of college with very good grades. active voice. So if I was taking notes on this, I would make a quick note about writing active voice, not passive. And I would say the object comes before the subject. Oh, sorry, the subject comes before the object. Great. So let's move on to our next topic. We're going to talk about apositives and how they relate to using commas. I know it's a very attractive subject, but we'll go through it quickly. But it's a worthwhile one. It's an issue I see all of the time at the Writing Center. So apositives. An apositive is a noun or pronoun set beside another noun or pronoun to explain or identify it. So in these three examples, I have the noun highlighted in blue and the apositive is highlighted in red. So for our first example, your friend, noun, Bill, apositive, is in trouble. So your friend Bill is in trouble. That sentence is perfectly correct. Our second sentence, my brother's car, comma, a sporty red convertible, is the envy of my friends. So car is the noun, and the apositive is in red as the sporty red convertible. And this is also a correct way of stating an apositive. So you can use commas to insert apositives, but especially when the apositive comes before the noun. So whenever you have something describing a noun coming before that noun, you need to have a comma. So in this third example, a beautiful collie, comma, Skip was my favorite dog. So let's look at some more examples. So when the information is essential to the meaning of the sentence, you don't need to place commas around the apositive. So in this example, the popular US president, John Kennedy, was known for his eloquent and inspirational speeches. So in this example, it's important to know which president we're talking about, so we don't need a comma to separate it. However, if the sentence is clear and complete without the apositive, then commas are necessary. Make sure you place a comma before or after the after the apositive. So John Kennedy, comma, the popular US president, comma, was known for his eloquent and inspirational speeches. So in this sentence, saying John Kennedy is enough. We don't actually need to clarify that he's the popular US president because we know who we're talking about. However, because we're adding it in, the descriptor, we want to use commas to insert it. So if I was taking notes on this, I would say identify apositives and commas and use them correctly. And feel free to ask any questions in the chat as they come up. I will try my best to answer them. I also want to be mindful of timing, so that's why I'm moving quickly. So what's wrong with this sentence? Mr. Johnson, who was working in his field that morning, said the herd of cows came out of nowhere. Feel free to put it in the chat. What is wrong with this sentence? It's very subtle. Good. Deborah says the comma is not necessary after the word said. It actually is necessary here because we're introducing the topic. Too many commas. The one after said is technically correct. Yeah, so this one's a tricky one, guys. So I'm going to point it out to you in the next slide. So look real carefully at this sentence. The thing that's wrong with it is the punctuation was on the outside. So I'm going to go back and show you at the very end there, it says nowhere, quotation mark, period, which is incorrect. The correct way to punctuate it is to do period, quotation marks. So ultimately, punctuation goes inside quotation marks. This is an error that I see all of the time at the Writing Center. So just make note of it. Punctuation goes inside the quotations. Deborah says that was tricky. Yes, that was a tricky one. It's a tricky one that a lot of us make that mistake and we don't even notice it because it's so small. But yes, it's very important to put punctuation inside the quotation marks.
Wait, I have a question that I don't think I can verbalize.
Well, good. So if I was making a note, I would just simply note punctuation goes inside quotations.
I have a question.
Deborah asks, is that a rule all the time? Yes. So punctuation always goes inside quotation marks. There's no exceptions to that. All right, we're going to move on to the next section. So we're going to talk now about more general writing tips. We covered kind of the grammar section, the fun stuff. I got that out of the way. And now we're going to talk more generally about writing style and writing tips for more when you're kind of approaching a paper. So transition statements. Here's some tips for transition statements. Transitions are a really tricky thing for a lot of my students that I see at the Writing Center. It's tricky because it's tempting to say something like next or so on, or, you know, as stated in the last paragraph, and those are not really strong transition statements. So let's look at some tips for what makes a good transition statement. First, the key to good transitions is highlighting connections between corresponding paragraphs. So you want to continue one paragraph where another one leaves off. Now, this can be tricky, and if that's the case, it probably suggests that your paragraphs are not in the right order. There should be a logical flow to your paper, and one paragraph should lead to the next paragraph. If it doesn't, ask yourself, do I need a different subheading here to separate my ideas, or do I need to reorder my paragraphs? Or maybe do I need to make more of a connection in my head before I start writing this paragraph? Another note is to pick up key phrases from the previous paragraph and highlight them in the next. So my tip is to not write transitions that could connect any paragraph. It's something I see all the time where it's like, next, right? Like people who use that, it's very elementary, and we want to use more specific transitions. So you want to instead write a transition that can only connect your specific paragraphs. So with all of these tips in mind, I'm going to show you a few examples. So here's a not great example. So the first paragraph ends with the sentence, overall, Management Systems International has logged increased sales in every sector, leading to a significant rise in third quarter profits. And then the next paragraph starts with, another important thing to note is that the corporation had expanded its international influence. So this is a transition. I would just say it's not a very good one. It's not specific, and it's something that could transition any paragraph in anybody's paper. So saying another important thing to note is kind of it's a lazy transition. It's not specific to this paper. So let's write a better one. Overall, Management Systems International has logged increased sales in every sector, leading to a significant rise in third quarter profits. Now, the next thing we want to say in our following paragraph is something about how it's expanded its international influence, right? So how do we combine these ideas? Well, here's one example. There's many different ways you can go about it, but in this example, these impressive profits are largely due to the corporation's expanded international influence. So notice it takes that idea about the profits from the first paragraph and transitions it to the idea about international influence in the second paragraph. Do we all agree that this second transition is a better transition? Feel free to in the chat to voice any questions or concerns about that. Candace agrees. Deborah agrees. Great. Great. So yes, this is a stronger transition. So let's look at another example. So again, here's a weak transition. First paragraph starts with, fearing for the loss of Danish lands, Christian IV signed the Treaty of Lubeck, effectively ending the Danish phase of the 30 Years' War. But then something else significant happened. The Swedish intervention began. Again, not a great transition. Why? Because saying, but then something else significant happened, well, I could have said that in any paper about anything. I could have written that in a paper about TikTok. And it's just not specific to what we're trying to go for. Oh, good. Deborah, thank you for pointing out Christian's name is spelled wrong. I gotta fix that. Thank you for pointing that out. Deborah's on the hunt for typos. I love it. So now let's look at a better, and there's Christian spelled wrong again. That's gonna bother me now. But let's look at a better transition. So we have the same ending sentence, fearing for the loss of the Danish lands, yada, yada, yada. But we want to segue from this idea to the idea about the Swedish intervention beginning. So what's a strong way of doing this? Again, you could go about it in many different ways. Let's just see what one example is. So shortly after Danish forces withdrew, the Swedish intervention began. So this is, again, taking that idea from the first paragraph and using it to transition into the second paragraph. All right, so I think you guys are getting the hang of transition statements. So let's look at one more example. Amy Tan became a famous author after her novel, The Joy Luck Club, skyrocketed up the bestseller list. There are other things to note about Tan as well. Again, a weak transition, right? There are other things to note about them. I could have said that anywhere. So we want to bring up this garage band in the next paragraph, right? So how do we transition? So I'm going to give you guys an example here of, here's the sentence from the last sentence from the first paragraph. And feel free in the chat to take a stab at how would you transition to this idea about the rock band? So take a moment to write your own transition. Deborah suggests just omitting that first sentence of the second paragraph. Deborah, that's a good instinct, but the problem with that is that it doesn't really transition the idea from the first paragraph, right? We want to include something from that first paragraph in the second paragraph. So we don't want to omit ideas from the first paragraph altogether, because saying Amy Tan also participates in a garage band is still not the strongest or most unique transition. We want to make sure we're transitioning that idea from the first sentence into the second one, or into the second paragraph. Candace suggests another famous thing she did was, very good, Candace, that's a great example. Anybody else want to take a stab at writing a transition? So Deborah says it can be noted that, again, it can be noted that could be used anywhere. So we want to write a transition that's more specific to Amy Tan and her book, right? So she wrote a book. And how do we transition this idea that she wrote a book and then she's in a garage band? Amy Tan can also be lauded for. That's much better, Deborah. Yeah, good job. So let's take a look at an example here. This will be our third and final example of strong transition statements. Amy Tan became a famous author after her novel, The Joy Luck Club, skyrocketed up the bestseller list. Though her fiction is well known, her work with the satirical garage band, Rock Bottom Remainders, receives far less publicity. You didn't need to know all of that detail. I think that example is even more specific than we needed to get. But I love this idea, though her fiction is well known. So it's taking that idea, it's a kernel of the idea from the first one, and it's transitioning it into the second idea. Yeah, Candace likes that. Candace, it's similar to what you wrote. So I thought that was strong, Candace. All right. So now let's take a look. So let's take a note. Write unique transitions. That's the key, is to make your transitions unique. So how to write a good transition? If it's something, ask yourself, could I have transplanted this transition into any other sentence or any other paper? If it could work in another paper, then it's probably too vague or too broad or not specific enough. So you really want to focus on making your transitions unique. So if I was to take notes on this slide or the slides that we all saw, that's the thing I would note to remind myself to write unique transitions. Unique like this little chameleon here. All right, let's move on to our next topic, writing for scientific outlets. So when we're writing for scientific outlets, we want to use plain language. Formal scientific writing is plain and straightforward. So things like metaphors, alliteration, anecdotes, and any other type of literary devices, they're a no-go. So one more time, metaphors, alliteration, anecdotes, and other literary devices, they're a no-go. So you also want to be concise and you want to be clear with your language. Psychology in particular stresses clear and concise prose. So some examples. If you said believed but could not confirm, there's a shorter way of saying that. You can just say assumed. If you wanted to say they have made it available, there's a shorter way of saying that. So let's be more concise by saying presents. Many of the things you can use for making a decision, instead of saying all of those words, that's a lot, that's very wordy, you could say criteria for determining. So these are just 3 examples of making your language more concise. Deborah asked, does Grammarly help with this? Oof, that is a sore subject for me. Grammarly can be super helpful 50% of the time. So about 50% of the time, Grammarly is good at catching things like conciseness and like giving you suggestions for words to make a phrase less wordy. But the other 50% of the time, Grammarly is like way off base or they're incorrect. So my suggestion with using Grammarly, if you do use it, is just to use it with caution. Yes, Jacqueline says 50% of the time is scary low. I recently helped a student and I watched them use Grammarly live in a session. And it was very interesting because, like I said, about 50% of the time, it was really helpful. But then the other 50% of the time, it was way off base. So you can use Grammarly. I would just caution you to really make sure you're being diligent while you use it. And honestly, when in doubt, make it a writing center appointment. So if you're really struggling with some Grammarly issues, or you're just confused, or you're not sure how to go through a paper using Grammarly, make a writing center appointment and we'll help you distinguish how to do it. And trust your instincts. That's the other thing I say. So If you feel like something's unclear and Grammarly is suggesting a way to make it clearer, then it might be right. But if you feel like Grammarly is suggesting something and it's making it more complicated or it's not making sense to you, then ignore it. So yeah, I say take Grammarly with a grain of salt. Good question though. One more thing for scientific outlets, we want to use evidence-based reasoning. So psychology bases its arguments on empirical evidence. So that means things like personal examples, narratives, and opinions. Do not use them. So one more time, personal examples, narratives, and opinions, we try to avoid them in a scientific outlet. The one exception to this, I would say, at the Chicago School is when you're writing a reflection paper and you're asked to use your opinion or write in the first person or reflect on something. So I've seen some reflection papers, and I think that's totally appropriate to use opinions and personal examples and narrative. But those aren't scientific outlet papers, right? They're not research papers, they're not dissertations. When we're writing our research papers, when we're writing our dissertations, do not use personal examples, do not use narrative, do not use opinions. All right. And then one little note, when you're writing for scientific outlets, in particular for the Chicago School, you want to use APA format. So this sounds like an obvious one. I'm sure the three of you know this, but psychologists use the American Psychological Association, the APA format for publications. One note, make sure you're using APA 7. APA 6 is outdated. And unless a professor is like still using it for some reason and they're asking you to still use APA 6, try to avoid using it and instead use APA 7. So for scientific writing, I would write down some notes. I want to write in clear, concise, and evidence-based language. So if I were taking notes on how to write for a scientific outlet, I would sum it up with writing in clear, concise, and evidence-based language. All right, so let's move on to our next topic. We're going to talk quickly about APA. Again, I have an entire presentation on APA, so if you've not seen that, I can send it to you. You can send me an email after this and I will send you a recording of my APA webinar, or I can invite you to the next one. But real quick, we'll talk about APA in-text citations. So when you're writing a paper and you're using an APA citation within the paper, when you have a single author, you can format it in one of two ways. You can say the author's last name, the year, and then say states that, da 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 da, or something like that. You don't have to say states that, but that's just my example. So it's part of the sentence. The alternative is to say, you know, blah, 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 blah in this study or whatever you want to sum up the sentence with, and then put their last name and the year at the end of the sentence. We call this a parenthetical citation because it comes in parentheses. Now, if you have two authors, you're going to put research by name and name. So you're going to spell them out if they're in the sentence. You're going to spell out A and D. Or if you want to put them in a parenthetical at the end of the sentence, you're going to put the name, use the ampersand symbol, and then the other name. So that's what you do for a single author. That's what you do for two authors. And now I'm going to show you what to do for three authors or more. So when you have three authors or more with APA 7, always, unless there's one little exception that I'll talk about in a second, but just about always, you're going to put et al. So you're going to put the first last name that's from your references page. So in this example, it's Kernus, and then we're going to put et al. And then the year. So you can do that within the sentence, or you can do it at the end of the sentence like a parenthetical. So that's what we do when we have three or more authors. The only time we have an exception to that is if you have multiple works with similar groups of authors, to avoid ambiguity, you write out more names. So in this example, we have Jones, Smith, Liu, Kim, Huang, and we also have Jones, Smith, Ruiz, Huang, and Stant, both in the same year. So that's super confusing for your reader. So you're going to want to clarify that by saying Jones, Smith, Louis, or Liu, and then say et al. And then Jones, Smith, Ruiz, et al. So you just want to list the first few names till it's clear that they're different citations. This is a very rare example. It doesn't come up that often. I've seen it once or twice in a dissertation, but it's just something to note. Is it in, I have a question here. So for the Corey ethics text, I should have been using et al. All along. Yes, I'm not totally sure what you're referring to, Candace, by the Corey ethics text, but if you're using a text that has more than three authors, yes, Candace. So if you're using a text with 3 authors, yes, you put et al. So you'd put Corey et al. And then Deborah's asking, is it incorrect to use first name et al? Yes. So Deborah, you want to use last name. The only exception to that is if for some reason the author doesn't have a last name, but I have yet to see that come up in my time at the Writing Center, and I've been here for almost a year now. So I have not seen an author without a last name. So always use the last name. Oh, okay, sorry. So Deborah's clarifying. Oh, yes. So Deborah, you want to use the last name of the first author and then et al. Correct. All right. So that's APA. Again, I'll go into much more detail in my APA webinar. So if you want to attend that, or I can send you that recording, we can go into that another time. But this is just some little details to remind you of for APA, things that I see come up all the time. People often forget to put et al. And it's okay. It's an old habit from APA 6, but try your best to put the first author's last name et al. So if I was to take a note on this, I would just make a note to remind myself to use proper APA citations, and in particular, APA 7. All right. So this is one of my final slides here for today. I'm going to leave you with some tips and tricks for better writing, for just becoming a stronger writer. So one thing I want to just wax on for a second is that writing is a process. A lot of times people think of writing as a product, right? I have a paper and my paper is due and I need to do my paper. When we think like that, we neglect the fact that writing is really all about so many more steps in that process. There is drafting, there is outlining, there is brainstorming. And then once you're done, when you think you're done with the paper, there's always rewriting, right? And in the rewriting phase, we have revision, we have rewrite, we have redrafting, we have editing, we have copy editing. So don't think of writing as just a product where one thing is one and done, but think of it as a process. And if we think about it as a process and we break it down, it makes it a lot easier for us. It makes it a lot less daunting. So especially I encourage you to use outlines. Well, let's get into that. So I recommend creating an outline before writing your first draft. That's my first big tip for becoming a stronger writer. Also, the beauty of creating an outline, once you've created the outline, it kind of does a lot of the writing for you, right? It's got the ideas organized. It's also got the headings and subheadings figured out for you. So I love outlining before writing. I think it's especially important at the Chicago School. It can really help you logically organize your paper. and help you come up with the ideas for your paper before you actually start writing. So it's a lot less daunting than looking at a blank page. So that's my first major tip. My next major tip is to follow the outline. So a lot of times people create an outline and then they kind of forget about it, right? So follow your outline and keep your first draft structured and organized. Of course, when you're writing it and you realize, oh, I can't transition between this paragraph and this paragraph, maybe you need to deviate from your outline. Of course, the outline's just there for you as a tool. But if it's not helping you, if it's getting in the way, then of course, rewrite it or scrap it and just start drafting after that. But I find that when we outline, like 99% of the time, it helps us keep our paper much more structured and organized. Now, when you're reviewing your writing, I encourage you strongly to read each sentence aloud to check for sentence clarity. We talked a lot today about different things to create stronger sentences. We talked about a positive, we talked about active voice. So when you're reading your paper out loud, a lot of times you'll catch those things that we talked about, avoiding run-ons, all the different things that we talked about today, and then some. So when you come to the Writing Center and you have a virtual session with us, oftentimes we use that strategy of reading the paper out loud because it's one of the best ways to catch your own work and to catch your own mistakes. And my final tip is to make an appointment with the Writing Center a week or more before the paper is due. So when you know a paper is coming up, especially because you get a syllabus that typically tells you when a paper is due well in advance, make those appointments out. So I would create an appointment in advance before you even started your paper. So that way, you know, when it's time to have your appointment, it's kind of like an internal deadline, first of all, which is great. Second of all, when you come to the Writing Center, we can help you with lots of different things, like anything from grammar to brainstorm. It's a week out. Oh, can everybody hear me? Okay, I'm better now. You can hear me now? Okay, good. Sorry about that. My internet went out for a second. Typical tech issues, right? The age we live in. Anyway, what I was saying was just simply, oh yes, so you can come into the Writing Center. We can help you with anything from grammar to brainstorming to outlining to all the other things that we talked about today, and then some. I just encourage you to make your appointments a week out because that way you don't risk having us booked up. We've been booked up lately. So for example, I had a student that wanted to make an appointment with me for today and I was completely booked. So just make sure that you make your appointments in advance so that way you can actually have them. Especially at this time of the semester, we get very booked up. Candace asked, where's the Writing Center located? Can we meet in person too? That's a great question, Candace. So I work on the LA campus by appointment in advance. So if you want to meet with me on the LA campus in advance, you got to work with me in advance and contact me. We can definitely arrange that meeting. But otherwise, our appointments are based online via like a Zoom platform that we have baked into our schedule. It's our own system where you can share the paper, you can share your screen, we can help highlight, annotate, things like that. Or you can submit your paper through e-tutoring. And that's when you submit the paper, we look it over, and then we send it back with comments and track changes to help you fix different issues. But that's a great question, Candace. So Candace, if you happen to be on the LA campus, I'd love to meet with you. Just send me an email. Oh, Candace is in Anaheim. Sorry, Candace. I guess we we can't meet in person, but definitely make a virtual appointment. It's just as good, I think, to be honest. Deborah says it's extremely helpful to send my paper and have you correct and comment on the paper. Yeah, different people like different things. So yeah, whatever you feel comfortable doing. We have virtual appointments and we have e-tutoring appointments. It's just up to you when you create the appointment, which type you'd like. And when I say e-tutoring, that's when you submit the paper and we send it back. And when we say online, that means you virtually meet with us, just to clarify. All right, so how do I make an appointment with the Writing Center? Great question. I'm so glad you asked. The Writing Center, here's our link. Of course, you probably can't click on this right now. So what I will do is I can send this out to you. So if you just send me a message, I will send you these slides so you can have them, and then you can click the link. We also have the Online Writing and Learning Resources Center. So that's a really great link that I've provided. And then finally, one resource that I like that's outside of our program is called Purdue OWL. They've got a lot of great information on APA. A lot of the stuff I went over today came from that website. So check out Purdue OWL for more information about how to become a stronger writer. All right, and that concludes our webinar for today. We're like running right on time. I have time for questions, so feel free to ask any questions. If you have to go, I understand. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Candace. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate you attending today. I hope this was helpful. Feel free to send me any feedback, or if you have any questions, my email is right here, cawritingcenter@thechicagoschool.edu. Deborah, if you're interested in the APA presentation, I will send it to you. So just send me an email so I can remember. But yeah, I'm so glad you guys came. I'm so glad you were able to make it. I'm sorry if there was issues in the beginning with technical issues, but yeah, have a great day. If there are no questions, I will end this presentation.